Federal Drive is presented by GEHA, Government Employees Health Association, proudly providing health and dental benefits to federal employees and their families. Visit GEHA.com.
And now, the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to the Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, August 6th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of the Federal Drive, breakthroughs get the headlines, standards rarely do. But supporters of a bipartisan bill say America's biotechnology future depends on measurement science that most people never see. Plus, better information often leads to better decisions. ARPA-H is investing in new technology designed to give clinicians a clearer picture of how a baby is tolerating labor. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. A long-standing framework meant to root out inadvertent discrimination in hiring assessments will no longer be required for agencies. An interim final rule that OPM issued last week eliminates the uniformed guidelines on employee selection procedures from federal personnel policy and regulations. The move aligns with a June opinion from the Department of Justice, which deemed the framework for hiring assessments unconstitutional. Federal News Network's Drew Friedman breaks down what the changes will mean with the Partnership for Public Service's Jenny Mattingly.
This framework was created back in the 70s. It's another one of these things that sort of 70s and 80s came up around how do businesses and the government, because it's both a public and private sector thing, how do you select employees for jobs and what types of tests or exams or assessments can you use to ensure that they don't have disparate impact, so that they aren't biased. They aren't biased against somebody in terms of this for race, religion, national origin, all of those things. So that rule was created in place because there were a bunch of court cases back in the 70s and 80s claiming that exams, like the civil service exam was one for federal employment, were biased. And so this rule, basically uniform guideline on employee selection procedures, which again, there's no good acronym for that. That's where this came from, was to try to put in place some framework for public and private sector to say assessments need to be valid and validated to ensure that they aren't biased against any one group of individuals.
I guess noting that it is for all employers, not necessarily just agencies, but can you give maybe some context of, is this something that has been successful over time? Have agencies or other employers been able to either identify or eliminate bias as a result of having that framework?
I think, yes, as a broad field, the field of assessments and, how we look at candidates for whether it's through structured interviews, through resumes, through technical assessments, that field has drastically changed since the 70s. And a lot of it was because of some of those lawsuits and others was how do you actually build both a field of professionals who know how to create valid assessments, and then how do you just build better assessments that aren't biased and that really are looking at the technical expertise. And my understanding from, IO psychologists and others who have worked in this field is that we've really come a long way in terms of the types of assessments that are out there. Now, that being said, part of the reason we've come a long way is because there was a framework in place ensuring that was at least a criteria or a thought of companies, and that candidates who felt like they had been unfairly impacted or the assessment that they had to take was biased, had a mechanism to actually question, through the EEOC, the hiring practices of an organization.
So just going chronologically here, there was a DOJ opinion in June that essentially is calling this framework unconstitutional. When you saw that opinion come out, I'm just curious, what was your reaction or response to the way that they framed their argument there?
I was surprised that that we were looking at I guess that anybody was looking at the uniform guidelines on assessments, because it is a much more technical sort of thing that's usually been in the realm of either EEO professionals or HR professionals. We certainly touched on knowing what the rules were when I was working on SMEQA and all the hiring, skills-based hiring in government. And nobody had, like, that claim had not been raised before. In fact, one of the principles, again, was that everybody's using fair assessments that judge people's skills. And so I was a little surprised that this has become an issue that's out there. But I do also think that, yes, the law itself needs to be modernized, but it's another case of where they're, instead of maybe modernizing a law from the 70s, 80s, it's being wiped off, usage altogether. And so I do think there's a moment to step back and say, how might we continue to update this law, but still maintain the principles of fair, equal opportunity for anybody looking for applying for jobs?
But just, considering the context of what has actually happened here most recently is with OPM's interim final rule on this, that looks specifically at taking these out of federal hiring processes. What do you see as the impact of that being for, how agencies conduct recruitment now?
I think it's less recruitment. It's more about what types of assessments they can or can't use. Now, I will say that, agencies, and we've talked about this before with skills-based hiring, I think the immediate impact is that agencies still aren't even using assessments to their full potential and capability. So I'm not sure people will see any immediate impact from this. What I do wonder, though, is that by removing sort of this guideline that assessments need to be fair, particularly in the age of AI, where there are questions about AI being biased, do we see a movement towards AI assessments of candidates that have bias built into them, whether even unintentionally people are questioning that about AI? So I do think it potentially opens the door and removes guardrails from going down that road. I would just go back to saying that agencies that have IO psychologists, and that's not many, it's a very niche skill set, but IO psychologists understand how to create assessments, how to make sure assessments are valid. Even without the framework, if you had, a robust HR team that had HR folks who understand this type of work, IO psychologists who can build credible, fair assessments, the framework is still important. And you also do have better assessments if you have those things in place. And that those elements aren't what agencies have. And I don't see OPM yet helping agencies figure out how to get there. So my one hope would be, if they are removing some of these sort of frameworks and guardrails, that they are equally focused on resourcing agencies to do assessments well.
Jenny Mattingly is Vice President of Public Policy and Stakeholder Engagement at the Partnership for Public Service. She's speaking there with Federal News Network's Drew Friedman. You can find Drew's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, breakthroughs get headlines, standards rarely do. But supporters of a bipartisan bill say America's biotechnology future depends on measurement science that most people never see. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.
Print servers in federal environments create risk and unnecessary complexity. Every new printer, location, or policy adds strain to infrastructure that was never built for today's demands. FedRAMP High Authorized Printer Logic eliminates print servers with a secure cloud-native, zero-trust solution designed for federal IT. With advanced security, centralized control, and simplified management, agencies can modernize print without added burden. See what secure serverless printing looks like. Visit Vasion.com to learn more.
Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The United States has invested heavily in biotechnology research, but supporters of a new bipartisan bill argue that innovation depends on more than scientific breakthroughs. They say measurement science and common standards are essential if new discoveries are going to move reliably from the laboratory to the marketplace. Here to discuss that effort is Congresswoman April McClain Delaney of Maryland's 6th District. Congresswoman, thank you so much for joining me today. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much, Terry. I really appreciate it.
You have just introduced a new bill called the Scale Biology Act, and it is about a term of art, I'll call it, federal biometrology at NIST. There probably aren't too many people who use that word biometrology in a sentence. So tell us a little bit about what you're trying to do with this bill.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, it is quite a mouthful. This is a bill that I just introduced with Ranking Member Lofgren, and also it's a bipartisan bill with Representative Albernolte on the other side and Mullen. And it's really important in terms of, the evolution of biotech and how we need to have common measurements and standards. I should back up and say I represent Maryland's 6th Congressional District, which houses the 270 corridor, NIST, NIH, National Cancer, Fort Detrick. And research is really foundational for a lot of our biotech industries, biopharma, and how we, in particular, NIST is kind of the gem in our country, and I think globally renowned for setting standards and how we measure things. And if you think about, we have trust in our measurements, whether it be in a pound, whether when we have, we are, whatever we are doing in terms of measurements, when you have trust in it, you have kind of interoperability and an ability to, use that data in a way which is cooperative and collaborative. My bill is really looking at having NIST conduct research and convene industry stakeholders, academia, scientists to unlock the bioeconomy, but particular to identify standards to safely bring emerging biotech to market and address safety and security concerns. So why is this important? As you know, our U.S. competitiveness with China is really one of the key issues for this administration, but for this country. And the National Security Commission on Emerging Biotech last year and the U.S.-China Economic and Security Commission identified this as a key issue that we need to measure the data of biotech as it emerges so that we're leading in the bioeconomy. I'm happy to talk a little bit more about it and get into it, but let's just have one example. In the last month, researchers just announced the creation of a fully synthetic cell, and they called it a SPUD cell. And as we make these unbelievable new discoveries, we need to be able to understand in common language between researchers around the world, how do you evaluate biotech and make sure that it is safe, and that particularly with the advent of AI, that when AI is looking at biotech or many of these molecular engineering biologies, that there is the same standard applied. It's very wonky, but very important.
Certainly, as we're thinking internationally, that idea of a common language and common standards is going to be very important. Why do we need a bill to encourage NIST to do this? Can't they just do it on their own?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, obviously, NIST is within the Department of Commerce, and it receives its funding from Congress. Also, all of its authorization comes really through what, Congress directs it to, and then is, administered through that agency. And so we do need to kind of give some parameters and authorize this type of a program, because NIST cannot just start any program at once. And in particular, down the road, we will need funding. Now, I will tell you on that note that my bill that I initially drafted had $350 million to convene this biometrology lab. And that would include things like convening universities, industry stakeholders, NIST scientists from around the world to kind of come together to create that roadmap, and then to also create the biometrology lab. We have not been able as a Congress to decide upon the exact amount that this biometrology lab will need. And, there are a lot of fiscal hawks and that are, pushing back. And so it was introduced, and it's also being introduced on the Senate side. And then we hope to come to a proper appropriations amount to make sure that we adequately resource this. But that's why we need to, because it includes resources, obviously it needs to go through appropriations and through Congress.
Congresswoman April McClain Delaney represents Maryland's 6th Congressional District. As you were just describing, a lot of the debate in Washington focuses on cutting costs and reducing headcount. And at the same time, you and so many others are saying that emerging technologies like biotech are a strategic national priority. So how should the government decide which of these scientific and technical capabilities are essential to preserve?
Very good question. Well, I think you need to look at where it's evolving. I mean, it is estimated that as we invest in research and development in biotech, that biotech will be up to $30 trillion in economic value by 2050. So we obviously want to be part of that biotech community and a leader in it as a country, but we also want our companies to be able to be in that and to employ workers here and also educate and have the workforce. So I think that what we need to do in Congress is to be visionary about what are the technologies and the trends of the future and how can we invest here, Maryland 6 and the 270 corridor, but across this whole country in those specific R&D resources that we need to be leaders. And remember, this also underpins not only our U.S. competitiveness, but it underpins, our collective health and well-being and evolutions and innovation and research and in public health, and also our national security. So I think it's this one in particular, I think is a no-brainer, which is why I think that we've, in a very partisan and chaotic time in Congress, this has incredible widespread bipartisan support.
As you said earlier, your district, Maryland's 6th district, is home to major federal scientific institutions that play an important role in biotech research, but you've also been hit really hard with some of the Trump administration's workforce reductions, program reductions, funding reductions. How do you reconcile that with the need to build out that functionality and build back the parts of the federal workforce that are going to support the biotech ecosystem?
Oh, Terry, thank you for asking that question. So important. I often say that Maryland has had a bullseye on it because we have so many of our leading research agencies. I've just been talking about NIH and National Cancer Institute, and Fort Detrick, which has a biometrology lab in terms of a lot of our COVID and a lot of our viruses and pathogens and parts of DOE. But across Maryland, I think that, we've had so many leading research agencies and also in Virginia and across the DMV. And it is nonsensical that this administration, through DOGE, went in and cut a lot of the workforce or is cutting many of the trials that are even cancer trials that are so fundamental to making groundbreaking research possible and really undercut our economy. So there's not, I think, a lot of rhyme and reason behind it. Sadly, for the last year and a half, and in Maryland, our entire team, we call it our Team Maryland delegation, including our governor, Governor Wes Moore, we've been pushing back against this administration in terms of these cuts. I think that there is this thought within the administration that it's better done in the private industry, but I have to get back to foundational researches. Private companies have an incredibly important part in terms of bringing products to market, but much of the foundational research that serves everyone has to be done by our leading researchers and agencies and universities, because often companies are very targeted on a small area that's going to make a return for their investors, and thus they don't have the holistic public health and well-being and collective national security issues at heart. And that's why it does not make a lot of sense to make these cuts, and we're pushing back. We also see a lot of cuts at our universities across the country. And the OMB directive that just came out about 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago has been causing great consternation in our leading research universities, as well as the administration's singular focus on the individual scientist who is perhaps funded by the private economy. It's a problem.
Your bill has been voted out of committee, not yet voted on in the floor, but if you are fortunate enough to get a vote and it becomes law, what would you be looking for 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now that would convince you as evidence that we're actually strengthening our biotechnology industry?
If we get this into law, and from your mouth to God's ears, and I think we've got a good shot, I think the success will be that there are uniform standards that could be used by AI, by international, scientists around the world. And what it will do is facilitate getting more products or technology to market. And I think that it would be in there really being a lot of innovation in health and helping us understand, different cures for many of the diseases we have. But also, there's a great deal of biotech that is looking at just different products, whether it could be in manufacturing, it could be in, different things with respect to even we've been talking about how technology is helping in the communications arena. There's a lot of different things that biotech can help synthesizing these cells, but we will not be able to do it in as quickly or as uniformly or as safely without having clear standards, a clear common language, and an ability for there to be interoperability. It will also give us, if we have a competitive edge and are still the leader in these fields, that means that this bill has worked.
Congresswoman April McClain Delaney represents Maryland's 6th Congressional District. Ma'am, thank you so much for joining me today.
Loved it. Thank you so much.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Still to come, data can reveal a problem, but solving it is another matter. New reporting examines the non-combat deaths of Army women and asks whether years of reviews and reforms have produced meaningful change. But first, better information does often lead to better decisions, and ARPA-H is investing in new technology designed to give clinicians a clearer picture of how a baby is tolerating labor. You're listening to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. For generations, doctors have had to make some of childbirth's most important decisions with incomplete information about how a baby is responding to labor. ARPA-H is funding research aimed at changing that by giving clinicians a clearer view of what's happening in real time. Here with more is Dr. Kate Arnold, Program Manager of Scalable Solutions at ARPA-H. Kate, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm really glad to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.
This is an important program at ARPA-H, and you're an OBGYN yourself. What is happening with the technology we use today to monitor moms and babies in delivery, and what does ARPA-H want to see differently?
So the first thing I would say is that our technology just has not changed. We essentially, as a medical community, adopted this fetal monitoring technology, which are these two little kind of hockey pucks that sit on a mom's belly when she's in labor. We adopted this technology about 50 years ago, and it has not changed since. It was adopted as an attempt to improve how babies did and to tell us when to do C-sections at the right time. And unfortunately, we really haven't seen moms or babies get better from this technology. We've instead just seen increasing C-sections and increasing liability.
The U.S. isn't doing so well when it comes to maternal and baby health overall. Is this part of the problem?
So when we look at our rising C-sections, a lot of it is because we have poor data. The fetal monitors are giving OBGYNs information that says you might need a C-section. And then we have to really make a lot of judgment calls there. And C-sections increase the risk of maternal mortality by at least threefold. So if we can get our C-section rate back down, we will 100% be able to improve maternal outcomes. Then we have the other side where sometimes we try to prevent the first C-section and we let a baby stay in an environment that doesn't have enough oxygen for too long. And that leads to bad neonatal outcomes. So if we can get good data about when intervention is needed, we should be able to improve on both of those populations' health.
So this program that you're overseeing is trying to tackle both of those problems. Are you going about it in the same way? Is there one magic bullet that solves both of these problems, or are you looking at different technological solutions?
It's many technologies, but it's all aimed at the central problem that we just don't have enough data to make good decisions on labor and delivery. So it's one problem, but we've funded many different technology solutions because we haven't seen anything that works in 50 years. So it's a high-risk environment and one that we really want to have lots of kind of shots on goals to make sure that we get a solution.
Sticking with that hockey puck analogy, I guess. Is the objective to be non-invasive with this technology?
Yes, absolutely. So the way that an ARPA program works is we really have lots of discussions with stakeholders. And one of the hardest things for this program is there are so many stakeholders. You think about the care team of nurses and doctors, and then you think about hospital leadership. You think about attorneys for these litigation cases. You think about insurance. We think about venture capital and industry. Why haven't things changed on that end? So we had so many discussions with all of those stakeholders to look at what is the dream scenario for this. And really the dream scenario is having a monitor that's accurate, that's comfortable, that's non-invasive, where moms could actually walk around during labor. And so those are all things that we've asked performers to design.
Dr. Kate Arnold is Program Manager, Scalable Solutions at ARPA-H. So you've just awarded some initial grants for this purpose. Tell us about how those teams are approaching the question.
Absolutely. So we have two fundamental questions that we funded performers to answer. The first is when a mom is in triage and we make the decision to admit her, how can we know her risk of having intrapartum fetal hypoxia, of having a baby that's low on oxygen that leads to all these interventions? We don't have any tests like that right now. So we've funded two teams to look at blood-based point-of-care tests for new biomarkers, and we funded one team to look at an autonomous ultrasound assessment of the placenta. The second problem is literally replacing our current standard of care for fetal monitoring. So we've asked them to take fetal heart rate and contractions, which are the two things we monitor right now, and add two novel sensors and then package it all up in something that's comfortable for moms, use AI and machine learning to integrate all of that data and put out one result that both the care team and the patient can understand about the fetal status.
AI is showing up in many of ARPA-H's solicitations these days. How do you see it fitting into this challenge particularly? Is it on the diagnostics? Is it on the data integration? Is it on the prediction of care outcomes?
It's the data integration. So when we think about adding new sensors, some of the sensors we're adding are like fetal EEG or placental oxygenation or fetal oxygenation. To validate each one of those sensors and get them to the point of FDA clearance and then figure out how to use that as needed device would take decades. Right now, what I can say is, hey, why don't you use these new sensors to get the data, and then let's put it all into AI and machine learning to see which sensors are giving us better information about that fetal status. So the bulk of the work is going into this new sensor design, but that's only possible that data is only actionable because of AI and machine learning.
How does the medical community in this space feel about integrating AI? Are they receptive to it? Are they nervous about it? Do they believe it?
I think OBGYNs have a very love-hate relationship with fetal heart rate tracings. You know, we know that they're terrible. We know that we need better data. And we also think that each one of us is better than the average at interpreting it. And so I think there is kind of this love-hate. We say we want help, but then we're kind of skeptical of any solutions. And so I don't think it's quite about AI and machine learning. I think it's that a lot of innovation happens without the end users in mind. We were able to host ACOG, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, at ARPA recently. They have been at Proposers Day. They were at Kickoff Day. We know that collaboration with the United States Organization of OBGYNs is going to make or break this program. And so we're so thankful that they've been supportive.
This program has a multi-year timeline. Do you anticipate being able to integrate interim learning into new practice?
I don't think that practice will actually change until these products hit the market. But I do think it's incredibly important for the medical community to see the development and to be part of the development. So we're asking performers to start presenting at conferences earlier than they probably would like to, because we want that engagement. My goal is in 4 years, when these products finish phase 1 clinical trials, I want every OBGYN to say, I can't wait for that to be on the market. I've been watching this product. I've been watching these scientists design this product that is going to revolutionize how I can care for my patients, and I can't wait to get it. The failure would be if it went to market and everybody said, what is this thing? Who designed this? Where did this come from? So we're working really, really hard to make the former a reality.
That approach seems somewhat different from some of the other things that we've talked with folks at ARPA about, this deliberate engagement both with the provider community and the care community, but also the investment community as you move the technology forward through the study and the awards. What provoked that particular approach in this case?
Well, I think as an OBGYN, we tend to be very practical and maybe a little bit literal. And so when I went to design the program, I said, well, the start of the program is where the science is right now. So that was meeting with scientists and saying, what can you do right now? What are you funded to do right now? And what do you wish you could do? And what might be possible? That's the start of the program. The end of the program is looking at the investment community and saying, how far would I need to take this crazy new product in order for you to invest in it? And that's where I ended the program, was from talking to industry and to venture capital and saying, if I had this target product profile and this end vision, what metrics would you need to see to invest in this? And as good stewards of taxpayer dollars, that's when ARPA ending should stop.
At the end of this program, your goal is to make maternal and infant care better. Will it be able to translate globally?
That is a great question. The first use case is the United States, but we also did a lot of work to see that nobody has a solution for this globally. No one. And so we've also been working with the Gates Foundation to look at these technologies and say, hey, maybe with follow-on funding from Gates, we would be able to take these technologies that are state of the art in the United States and make them a little bit, less expensive, more durable, more appropriate for third world use.
That is an exciting outcome.
Yes, absolutely.
Dr. Kate Arnold is Program Manager for Scalable Solutions at ARPA-H. Thank you so much for sharing this program with us today.
I'm very passionate about it. I'll talk about it anytime, any day.
We'll check back in 3 or 4 years and find out how you're doing.
Thank you.
We'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. Coming up next, data can reveal a problem, but solving it is another matter. New reporting examines the non-combat deaths of Army women and asks whether years of reviews and reforms have produced meaningful change. This is the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. Welcome back to the Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network. The Army has spent years studying sexual assault, domestic violence, and other threats to the safety of service members. New reporting on the non-combat deaths of Army women raises a difficult question. What happens when an institution understands a problem but struggles to improve outcomes? Here with what they found are Austin Campbell and Daniel Johnson reporting for The Intercept. Austin and Daniel, I really appreciate you joining me today.
Absolutely. Thanks for having the both of us on.
Austin, this is a tough topic to talk about. Your reporting uncovered a striking finding about the causes of death among women in the Army. Before we get into a lot of the details, what was maybe the very most surprising thing you learned as you reported on this story?
I think the most surprising thing was that women in the Army were dying by homicide and suicide at roughly twice the rates of civilian women. And intimate partner homicide was at least 3 times the national average, and more than half the women were killed by service members or veterans. So we found significant gaps in the Army's own homicide data between what we found in our reporting.
What is the explanation for those extraordinary rates of violence? Daniel?
Yes. The research fundamentally points to really the U.S. Army and DoD's culture of masculinity. Just if I was women, it also meant you don't fit the masculine idea as a key driver of this violence, right? And it's not just this culture, but it's a variety of systemic failures. Not just women dying of homicide due to intimate partner violence or male service members killing them, even if they're strangers, due to the lack of safety, but also suicide due to a lack of mental health support and systems that support their well-being. It's multifaceted. And based on what we found, this leads to these egregiously high rates of death among these personnel.
Daniel, let's follow that on with a couple of extra details here. I mean, you looked at more than a decade of data, and this is not a story about a single installation or just a handful of cases. What patterns did you find as you looked into that data?
So the data came about a lot due to frustrations how the DoD reports on these issues, especially issues like a blast over pressure mortality rates. They often don't compare their numbers to other populations, so it makes the numbers kind of useless. I started looking at the unique risks suffered by female service members when I was getting my PhD at UNC. And when the Army gave me a spreadsheet with over 5,000 deaths in 14 years of data, it was hard to try to figure out what to make of it. So I had to compare it to DoD, FBI, and CDC numbers. And what I found in the trends is that over this time period, the rates of death for homicide and suicide were higher. And even after the reforms, after the death of Vanessa Gillian, the rates of suicide and homicide actually increased in the United States Army. And that was extremely troubling due to all the press and all the legislative changes that had occurred. It implied that these changes perhaps are not effective. And it's unclear what we can do with that. Because if we attempted to fix the system and it wasn't fixed and people are still dying, then what are the next steps? And that was really what was troubling to me.
And Austin, what do you want to add?
When Daniel and I were looking into the actual homicide data that we had pulled out and acquired from that larger data set, it was overwhelming to see that disproportionately speaking, you had junior enlisted to NCO ranks overrepresented in the homicides, and they were primarily women of color that we were seeing. So you have young women of color who are making lower income by DoD standards, who are in a greater risk of vulnerability. And I think that was like one of the more systemic issues that we were able to pull out very quickly from the data.
And Austin, the reporting also raises a question about how the Army even tracks these. And Daniel just mentioned that the data is really difficult to make sense of. How confident can anyone be in this situation that military leaders or Congress or even the public really have a full picture of what's happening on the ground in Army units to women?
I think my degree of confidence in public perception and lawmaker perception is relatively low at this point. But I would say the individual anecdotal perspective of service members is probably quite high. I don't think this was surprising to anybody who was in the force. And that means not just Army, any of the service branches. We had a lot of people approach us after reporting, say, hey, I went through something similar, or this is not a one-off. And that, I think, was indicative of the greater pattern we said, that this isn't an isolated case, and this is something you're seeing at multiple bases over a recurring period. So the degree of confidence, again, to echo, is low at this point for me.
And Daniel?
And I would say, even when we contacted the United States Army about our data, we told them that we had a certain amount of homicide deaths, and the Army came back and said they found more, but didn't clarify. So if this is a FOIA with all the non-combatant deaths, the Army says that 7 more deaths occurred in the 2-year time period. The question is, how's this data being tracked and who has the true numbers? And that's something we could not figure out. Even after the article was released, I went back to the FOIA and I found additional deaths during this time period that the FOIA wasn't even tracking. So it's unclear who has the full information. If we don't have the full information, how can we adequately deal with this issue or tackle this issue?
Daniel Johnson is a teaching fellow at the University of Tübingen. Austin Campbell is an investigative reporter, and both write for The Intercept. Daniel, let me follow on with this, because I will say here, I am a retired female Army officer, and this information is really disturbing. And you mentioned at the top of our conversation, the military's culture of masculinity. It's certainly been a topic even in the news over the past couple of weeks. So if institutional attention starts shifting away from these issues, what makes us think the outcome gets better if we make it less visible?
I don't think it will get better. I mean, I honestly think if the DoD or Department of War is shifting away from attention for issues faced by women service members, as we've seen with the removal of a lot of organizations such as we wrote about an article, I apologize.
Dakowitz.
That's Dakowitz, yes.
I was just writing it down myself.
Yeah. I mean, that's not going to make the problem better, because now we don't want to have institutions that specifically focus on this issue. I think that things that could be done, there has to be more reporting and more data-driven reporting. But people we interviewed talked about the need for independent committee that looks at, like we looked at sexual assault, looked at homicide among women in the military, an independent committee that looks at domestic violence among women in the military, to keep this issue in the national consciousness and to keep the institutional pressure on. Because if we don't talk about it, it's just not going to go away. And then 5 to 10 years later, there'll be another report showing these systemic trends.
Austin, the current leadership in the Pentagon talks a great deal about standards and discipline and warfighting and lethality. Based on your reporting, do you think that the senior leaders view violence against women and sexual assault and domestic violence as a readiness issue, or are they thinking this is something for the sexual assault office over in the corner to deal with?
I would argue they view it as a non-issue. Over the past year or so of my reporting on the different service branches, Army and Air Force in particular, and as you made mention of your service background, both Daniel and I are veterans ourselves, so we have some individual background and knowledge on the matter, but I don't think the current leadership in the Pentagon focuses on any issues that could deal with retention and recruitment rates, if that tracks with you. I think fundamentally speaking, they try to diffuse and shift blame to be in a way that like it won't come up when we ask questions. Daniel and I are both sitting on an overwhelming amount of data provided to us firsthand by the DoD. And when we approach them with the same data they gave us, they kind of have this walk around pattern of answering as minimally as possible. So one of the things that we saw in the reporting that was alarming, and it's been reported by other outlets as well, is the minimization of resources for family and women and the access to actually seek counseling or what have you. And then a recurring topic that we have come up are FAP and IDC committees, and basically the preponderance of evidence that's needed in order to get a proper attribution to the case for what's going on can be different from what's happening with civilian investigators. So it's difficult for service members to know where to go because these resources are being stripped away. And it's also difficult for these resources to then get I won't want to say justice, but the justice they deserve for their cases, because the DoD is insular in the fact that they don't necessarily want to prosecute and have these cases come to light in the civilian sense.
Austin, let me follow up on this, and Daniel, certainly feel free to jump in. The impact on women in the force is obvious from just the title of our discussion. Did you uncover any retention or readiness issues on a unit where an incident like this has happened?
I would say nothing I could find for a unit specifically. One of the cases, Mary Diaz, before she joined the U.S. Army, she had heard about the case of Vanessa Gillian, and she told her mother that hopefully this would not happen to her. And unfortunately, as we reported, it did in a way, and the Army failed her. What that means overall for how the military recruits and retains women is still an open question, because it's not clear what that data shows year after year. But I do know under the Biden administration, it was a big issue because recruiting and retention rates were down. I would think if the DoD does care about recruiting and retention, then they can take steps to show that they're dealing with the issue. People we interviewed talked about the need for better data tracking. People talked about the need for things such as barrack safety, things the Department of War could go to Congress and ask for if they say this is hurting our ability to fight wars and maintain our lethality.
Austin, do you want to add anything there?
I think one of the things that we were really optimistic for this year is with the National Defense Authorization Act for 2027. We were hoping that our reporting, given that we had spoken to Representative Chrissy Houlihan, would maybe make its way into the NDAA for the House. And typically those come out from, I believe, October to January is when they pass the House. And this year, obviously, it passed yesterday in July because of the integration of the SAVE Act and some of the controversies that were following the Section 219, Section 224 previously regards to the Israel co-integration of military technology. So it doesn't seem like our reporting will be in the NDAA this year because of some of the, I want to say, political charades that maybe took place that passed the NDAA so early. But I do think ultimately we're still optimistic that there are lawmakers who are aware. There are obviously senior leaders of the Pentagon who are aware. And I will say neither Daniel nor I really believe that the DoD or DOW doesn't care. I do think they care tremendously. I do, but I also, with a caveat, think that the DoD has a track record of self-preservation. When you're in the business of war, things can be really messy and things can be misunderstood by the civilian population very readily. And you don't want to provide talking points for mainstream media to run on and maybe make retention and recruitment more difficult. So I've had people routinely who have been in senior leadership positions reach out, and they're very moved by this reporting. They're moved by other reporting that have victims, and they want to see a change, but change can only come from within. And a lot of people will point towards Congress needs to do something here. And I would argue that the DoD or DOW needs to do something. The data's there. They have the data. We have the data. It's time for some internal accountability.
Austin Campbell is an investigative reporter, and Daniel Johnson is a teaching fellow at the University of Tübingen, both writing for The Intercept. Thank you both for the work you've done here, for the story you've brought forward, and for the conversation today.
Thank you very much.
We'll post this interview and a link to the article at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts. The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton is produced by Eric White and Michelle Sandiford. Our web editor is Stephanie Wright. For the latest updates, stay with federalnewsnetwork.com or follow us on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Up next, the top national headlines from ABC News and the Federal Newscast. I'm Terry Gerton. Thanks for listening.
And now, The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton, sponsored by GEHA.
Welcome to The Federal Drive on Federal News Network. It's Thursday, August 6th. I'm your host, Terry Gerton, and I'm glad you're here. Coming up on this hour of The Federal Drive, breakthroughs get the headlines, standards rarely do. But supporters of a bipartisan bill say America's biotechnology future depends on measurement science that most people never see. Plus, better information often leads to better decisions. ARPA-H is investing in new technology designed to give clinicians a clearer picture of how a baby is tolerating labor. Those stories and much more ahead during this hour of the Federal Drive. We begin with this. Military spouses have long faced challenges that come with frequent moves, career disruptions, and balancing family life during deployments. Now, a new White House executive order creates the President's Military Spouse Commission, a panel charged with developing recommendations on issues ranging from employment and childcare to healthcare, education, and housing. The administration says the commission will give military spouses a direct voice in shaping federal policy, but questions remain about what authority it will have and how quickly it can deliver results. Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen joins me now with more details. Rachel, thanks for being here.
Hello, Terry.
I feel like we've been around this block a couple of times, but at the highest level, what is this time around the President's Military Spouse Commission designed to accomplish?
Yeah, it's a perennial issue through, across multiple administrations, right? So this is kind of the latest stab at the topic. So this commission would be chaired by Jennifer Hegseth, who is Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary's wife. It would include more than 20 spouses of military and civilian leaders across the military, enlisted officer, Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of their spouses, and the spouse of the Secretary of Homeland Security as well, because Coast Guard falls under Homeland Security. So, they're really trying to get a broad cross-section of experiences, not just focusing on officers, not just focusing on one kind of subset. But, the biggest difference is that it creates a White House level, presidential level advisory committee, whereas previous efforts have been led, by or housed within DoD, housed within the services. So it elevates it a little bit more. It was established by executive order. And so it has a broader mandate. And, what we have yet to see is there was already a DoD family panel that was kind of put on pause because the administration wanted to review all of the various advisory panels across the department. So it's a little unclear if they're going to dovetail, if this is going to supersede them, how it's going to fit into the ecosystem of all the people who are already thinking about spouse issues.
The executive order highlights issues like employment and childcare and education and healthcare and housing. Those have all been prominent issues that turn up in military families surveys. Does the executive order highlight a priority order there, or which ones are most important?
It doesn't highlight a particular priority. It says, go out, talk to people, see what they think the biggest issues are, and certainly the members of this committee can also bring their own lived experiences too. Employment is certainly at the top of the list for many people. Unemployment and underemployment as well have been above 20% for military spouses for years. And there's been a lot of work at the federal level and within the services and whatnot to make licenses, more portable across state lines. So if you're licensed to perform a skill in Maryland and you get, you PCS to Washington State or something, you can still perform that job there. But, there's still a lot of other factors, childcare, also something DoD has been working on to, some success. And housing affordability is also, a growing problem in a lot of locations, right? You PCS somewhere new, you're going to be there for a few years, but are you able to cover the cost of living, especially if you're only a one-income household, right? If you're facing the unemployment issue as a spouse.
Rachel, the commission is supposed to provide recommendations to the president rather than try to implement policy itself. Are there recommendations that could realistically translate into changes across the federal government and the military services?
Yeah, so they're going to have to focus on things that the executive branch actually has authority to do things about, right? In terms of changes to law, they can recommend things to Congress, but that would still have to go through, probably as part of the NDAA or something like that. So areas where the executive branch could kind of make moves are, making it easier to work remotely if you're a federal employee. There's folks on the Hill that have been asking the administration for more information on that recently. Improving how federal agencies coordinate during PCS season. If you have a spouse who is a federal worker who is moving somewhere else, with their military member, and doing more to kind of streamline access to childcare, streamline access to healthcare, through HHS, through, whatever other levers that they have.
You mentioned military spouse employment and unemployment and underemployment, and you've also said PCS several times. Many of the family welfare studies attribute a lot of these problems at the root to the PCS cycle, making military families start over every 2 or 3 years, which uproots spouse employment, which uproots children, which makes housing affordability a perennial problem. Are there new approaches here that you think this group will recommend?
I think it'll be interesting to watch, how what they try to do in terms of furthering efforts that are already underway to limit PCSs. The Air Force multiple years ago rolled out an initiative that said, hey, if you find somebody who wants to trade jobs with you so you can stay at your base, or, if you want to move to a specific base because it's closer to your family or whatever, the services have been trying to put a little bit more of that stability in place while also keeping in mind the fact that if they need you to go somewhere, they need you to go somewhere. And so, I am interested to see if the committee does anything, to kind of further that.
Rachel, does the executive order require this group to have public meetings, or does it set a deadline for reports or out briefs on what they're finding or what their recommendations are? I mean, how will people know if they're doing anything or making a difference?
Yeah, I think on the one hand, because it's a presidential commission, there's obviously interest at that level in touting it as something created, because the administration wants to show that it's doing good things for spouses, right? So I do think that they will want to come out and discuss what they're talking about. They are also going to make reports to Congress, I believe, annually. So, that will be a record of what they're doing.
That's Federal News Network's Rachel Cohen. Rachel, thanks for giving us the update. We'll look forward to following up.
Yeah, thank you.
You can find Rachel's story at federalnewsnetwork.com. Up next, breakthroughs get the headlines, standards rarely do, but supporters of a bipartisan bill say America's biotechnology future depends on measurement science that most people never see. This is The Federal Drive with Terry Gerton on Federal News Network.